With having worked in so many different settings as a psychiatric nurse practitioner, many of you guys have been asking me which setting is my favorite setting to work in. And in this video, I'm going to be going over my favorite setting, the pros and the cons, and what I like most about it. So stay tuned. Welcome back to another episode of Life of a Psych NP. If you are new to this channel, let me formally introduce myself. I'm Darty. I'm a board-certified psychiatric nurse practitioner, and in this channel I go over several different subjects to educate the public about mental health, ways to improve your lifestyle, topics related to nursing, nurse practitioners, and specifically psychiatric nurse practitioners like myself. So if you are interested in any of these topics, feel free to subscribe. Make sure you like this video because it helps me out so much, and follow me on Instagram at LifeofaPsychNP. So, you probably clicked this video because you're interested in finding out what my absolute favorite setting to work in as a Psych NP. And as many of you guys already know, I've worked in so many different settings. And obviously I've missed a few because I've only been practicing for a little bit over 3 years. But for the most part, I've worked in a community mental health setting. I work at a current urgent care crisis stabilization. I work at a busy outpatient private practice, and as recently I have my own private practice. And yes, there's so many different options to work in. You can work in the school setting, you can work in jails, you can work in big organizations, or you can even work in the inpatient setting. And like I said, I don't necessarily have as much experience as other Psych NPs, but this is kind of just my opinion and what I like about it. So without further ado, let's go over my favorite settings and why I like working there, what are the pros and the cons, and ultimately which is my absolute favorite setting to work in. So let's go. So let me clarify it. So I'm going to be going over my top 3 places to work in, and I'm going to be giving you my absolute favorite setting to work in, especially as a psychiatric nurse practitioner. So the very first setting that I want to talk about is the community mental health setting. So these range from very high acute patients and all the way to moderately acute patients, but you're primarily dealing with serious mental illness patients, so SMI population. And the reason why I did put this on my list is because you get to deal with very high acuity patients, and you get to start to learn a lot more, especially as a new grad. You get to learn a lot of different combination of patients. You get to deal with the popular patients that definitely want to be able to continue the services. And another pro of working in this setting is you typically will get more time with the patients. So you'll either get an hour to 2 hours for initials depending on your location. I'm just going based off of what my experience and what I've heard about within California. And then also you usually get from 30 minutes to a 60-minute follow-up. So this is great, especially as a new grad. You get to be able to learn so much. But like I said, a lot of these patients are higher acuity, so you have to deal with patients that may be on multiple antipsychotics, multiple mood stabilizers, that are maybe still suffering from certain disorders and certain symptoms of that disorder that you may have to continually deal with, and you may have to see even closer than monthly follow-ups, maybe even 2-week follow-ups. But like I said, there are so many different resources out there. So which is another pro of working in a community mental health setting is you have resources. So you have caseworkers, you have case managers, you have therapists, you have social workers, psychologists, you have psychiatrists. You have abundance of help, especially when providing the continuity of care that patients sometimes need, and maybe what they need to in order for them to get through their best. And they provide you help with housing, they provide you help with food, they provide you help with transportation, and that ultimately is going to impact how they feel as a whole. So that's kind of what I like about that setting. But obviously there are cons to each setting also, and this type of setting, based off of my experience, it was run by the therapy side of things, so they didn't necessarily understand the medical or the nursing side of things, and they tried to dictate a lot on the way we provide care, when realistically they didn't necessarily have the education in order for them to prescribe medication. So that's constant battle that you have to find, especially in certain community mental health centers. I'm not saying it's all happening everywhere, but that's kind of my experience as a whole. And then another one is sometimes, depending on the severity of the patient, we still may be lacking some resources. And a lot of times, just because we have so many resources, they don't think that there's another higher level of care. In reality, sometimes they may need additional help than what we can provide, and sometimes that we don't necessarily are able to offer that. So that's kind of another con. And then another con is that a lot of times there's going to be not as much freedom, especially with what you want to practice and how you want to practice. There's usually set to a certain formulary of medications that you can choose from, because sometimes their insurances or whatever the case may be may not cover it, or your collaborating psychiatrist, in my situation, doesn't like using certain medications, so that kind of limits the way you practice. So obviously there's other pros, other cons, but I want to keep this video short, so I just want to explain that process within itself. So the next setting that I want to talk about is outpatient private practice. So I work in a very, very busy outpatient private practice, and I have my own outpatient private practice, and they can range in the type of patients you see. In my own private practice, they are very, very, for the most part, stable, high functioning, maybe first onset of depression, anxiety, ADHD, maybe one history of hospitalization, things like that. But it can range to a private practice where you see very high acute patients that may be necessarily even moved up to community mental health setting, or maybe just graduated from that setting and then now needing a lower level of care. So it just all depends on kind of where you're looking at. But I kind of just want to give you my kind of opinion on the pros versus the cons. So the pros is very good schedule. You have the flexibility of kind of choosing your schedule, obviously depending on where you're working, but for the most part you're not on call, you're not really working nights, you're working that Monday to Friday schedule, which a lot of people love, and you're kind of seeing patients during that time frame. Usually in private practice you don't necessarily have as much time, so it can range from 30-minute initials to 60-minute initials, or doing 15-minute follow-ups to 30-minute follow-ups. Obviously in my private practice I can schedule the flexibility. If I know I'm going to take more time with this patient, then I'm going to schedule it out even further. But if you're working for someone or you're working in a busy private practice, you kind of have to rely on that. But for the most part, schedule's great. I'm sure that you can have time off and just have that flexibility to do so. Patients in this type of settings typically are going to be lower levels of acuity, so they're not necessarily super acute where you're having trouble managing their care. A lot of the times they have jobs, they're functioning well, they have resources, or they have a good support system for you to manage them. And like I said, it kind of just ranges, so it all depends on where you practice. Obviously there's cons, so you're not necessarily, some cons are you're not necessarily dealing with these higher acuity patients. So when you get a patient that is dealing with something that you're not used to, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to control or being able to manage their symptoms. And another thing is, sometimes you might be restricted to a schedule of just 8-hour shifts. Maybe you want to work somewhere else. Sometimes in these things you have to manage these patients within that 8-hour shift, so it's not as much flexibility in that sense. But like I said, it all kind of depends on where you work. Luckily in my the outpatient private practice that I work in, it's very flexible. I can do 8 hours, 10 hours, or even 12 hours depending on how much I want to work. So it just all depends in that setting. So I think I'm going over cons, I just totally forgot, but another con of kind of this place is you are going to be dealing with managing care. So with outpatient private practice, you have to manage their care throughout how long you're treating them. So all the hiccups, all the goods, the bads. You're going to be managing it, and if you can't necessarily get a hold of it in the very beginning, then it's going to start to get more and more difficult to manage, especially if you're utilizing all of your resources and you're not necessarily getting the results that you want. And then also another con is you don't necessarily have the amount of resources such as the community mental health setting, in terms of helping them with housing, helping them with food, helping them with transportation. There's not that much we can do in the outpatient setting, so that's where we typically will defer if they need all of those things, especially if they're homeless and they need those resources. Then we'll defer to the community mental health side because they have all of those resources. And it kind of sucks because you're doing so good, you built up this rapport, but then there's only so much you can do in the outpatient setting compared to what they can do in the community mental health setting. So that's kind of a con, and those are things, obviously there's more pros and there's more cons, but I kind of just wanted to give you a little overview and kind of give you my reasoning on what I like about this setting and what I don't like about this setting, and then ultimately give you what I love most. So the third and final setting that I wanted to talk about is the urgent care crisis stabilization. So the urgent care crisis stabilization, if you watch a lot of my other videos, I talk about this in the past, but the one I work at, they have a crisis walk-in center, so you can walk in for med refills, evaluations, or if you're actively suicidal, homicidal, or having psychosis, you can walk in and we'll evaluate you. Or there's the other side of things where there's actual units, so we have an adolescent unit, children adolescent unit, 12 and above, and then also we have an adult unit that we take all ages. So, and that's where they usually will come in crisis, on holds or like involuntary holds, or they walk in the middle of the night and they need someone to evaluate them, or they don't feel safe, they'll come in voluntarily, or they come in from the crisis walk-in center where we don't necessarily think they're stable enough, and then we'll admit them to the unit. So that's kind of the case in this sense. So we do a lot of different things, especially in this setting. The pros are you kind of get a gist of how high, or just of how to treat patients, especially when they're pretty emergent. So if they're having active SI, active HI, they're actively hallucinating, and it's getting to a point where it's extremely negative on them, negatively impacting what work, school, or whatever the case may be, their personal life. You get to see how they are in that acute phase. That's a great thing about it, because you kind of have that emergency type of deal, like type of setting where you're dealing with emergent patients. Obviously there are some cons to where you're working, because you're dealing with these higher acuity patients and you're constantly dealing with it, and it's getting more and more difficult, especially when you have to educate the family, you have to treat the patients, you have to treat the patients that walk into the crisis walk-in center while still treating the patients in their back of the urgent care. So this can get difficult, especially if you're dealing with so much, especially depending on the day. But for the most part, this is a great opportunity, because a lot of times when you see this patient, more than likely you're not going to necessarily see them. And the good thing about this is you are able to provide those resources also, since we have therapists, patient family advocates, so we have social workers, we have psychiatrists, so we can always defer to them also. So that's a great thing about it. And like I said, this one, another pro is schedule. The schedule's great. We work 12-hour shifts. We work our 3 12s. Well, I only work 2 12s there because I'm part-time, but people can just work their 3 12s and kind of get out of the way, and they don't necessarily have to worry about the patients anymore after that, compared to even an outpatient or a community mental health center where they're part of your patient load, and you have to constantly be thinking in the back of your head, oh, did I make the right decision? How are they doing? I wonder what's going on, things like that. Because here is, once you kind of leave, you're gone for the day. You don't necessarily have to be on call or anything like that. Obviously there's cons. You don't necessarily understand the concepts of using certain medications to help them in the long run, such as working in the outpatient or a private practice or a community mental health setting, where you'll start a medication and then you'll see how it's working, to see what's working, and then having to deal with certain consequences or benefits of the medication, such as weight gain, having to deal with labs, having to deal with all of those things. But I think it's good in that sense because you get to understand the whole total package of how to treat a patient, as opposed to just treating them and then letting them either go out the door, transferring to a different hospital, or just monitoring him, but you don't necessarily see the bigger picture. You're just kind of dealing with what's in front of you, the emergent situation, and going from there. Like I said, there are cons. You don't necessarily get the full exposure of practicing with certain medications and seeing how it's going to impact them in the long run. So yeah, I think all three of these settings are great settings. I think at the end of the day, it just all depends on you. So as you guys have all been waiting for, let me go ahead and talk about my favorite practice setting. So my favorite practice setting, and you guys all probably already know, is going to be outpatient private practice. I think this is where we get to absolutely use all of our tools, especially when it comes to managing patients in psychiatry. I love the fact that we're able to see patients that are very, very brand new to mental health, maybe medication naive, maybe in therapy and wanting to try medications for the first time, and then also ranging to patients that have been hospitalized multiple times, have tried all the medications. We get to manage all of these type of patients, and we get to use the scope of our practice to the full extent, especially because sometimes we can get patients that are very, very, very acute, and sometimes we don't get patients that are not acute at all. But we get to be able to manage a patient load and manage several levels of acuity of patients to our best of our ability. And this is a great thing because at the end of the day, there's always other resources we can kind of defer to, but for the most part, we get the full range of our scope of practice within an outpatient setting. We get to start medications, we get to monitor labs, we get to monitor their vital signs, we get to monitor their signs and symptoms, and seeing how they're progressively getting better or maybe even worse. But as you get to start practicing and you start getting your patient load and you start helping patients, you get to see how they've had so severe symptoms compared to how they're going back to work. Maybe they're starting a family, and you get to follow them along. And I think that's the most rewarding thing, is helping impact how they are and how the symptoms have months affected them to compare to how it's managed and how they're starting their life all together. So it's amazing, especially in that sense. And another thing is, I love being able to utilize newer medications. I've learned the old school medications in community mental health settings, or like, I'm not gonna say old school, but I've learned to use certain types of medications that some providers don't even utilize, and I'm starting to learn about the newer medications that the older providers aren't utilizing, and just kind of rounding out my style and how I can utilize both, especially to the full extent, to help these patients out in helping them towards their goals. And I think that's the biggest thing. And in the outpatient setting, I'm able to do that. And also, I have a family, so I still want time with my kids. I want weekends off for my kids. I want to get off at 4 or 5 o'clock just so I can be able to spend time with my kids, bring them to their games, bring them to after school activities, all of those things. And this is the biggest thing that is going to help me out, especially in outpatient private practice, because when you go to certain things like inpatient hospitals, ERs, urgent cares, sometimes you're there for 10-12 hour shifts, and sometimes you're going to miss opportunities that you can't even do, especially when it comes to working from 8 to 8. You're going to miss all of your children's activities because by the time you get home, they're going to be asleep. So that's kind of my rationale on certain things. Everyone's different. Some people like the fact that they can work 3/12s and have 4 days off. Great, but at the same time, you're still missing out on opportunities. And that's where I had to choose, and I'd rather just work Monday through Friday or maybe Monday through Thursday, my 8-hour shifts, and have that flexibility to do certain things beyond just work. And I think at the end of the day, you have to find that good work-life balance, and I think in this setting that gives me the best opportunity to do so. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it felt like I was all over the place because I was, but at the same time I kind of just wanted to give you my opinions without even writing down any notes. Just wanted to give you my full honest opinions about these 3 settings and why I absolutely love working in the outpatient private practice. Maybe it helps open up your ideas or your mind or your mindset on which opportunity you want to take, and hopefully it helped. And as always guys, make sure you like this video, and if you haven't followed me already on Instagram, follow me there, LifeofaPsychNP. And until next time, have a wonderful day guys. Bye.